Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today this has been a video that I have been waiting to make. And I'm super excited to be making this video today because I want to talk about my top 5 favorite middle grade fantasy series. So all of these pretty much come from the 2000s. They are all middle grade fantasy series with at least 3 books in the series, and these are my favorites. I love these so much. In fact, some of them I have reread and some I want to reread because I just love them that much. So this is as of right now, because as I was looking through my shelves, I thought well, that series I liked, but I don't think it was in my top 5. So these are definitely my top 5 favorite series. So let's dive in and find out what they are. Number 5 is the Keys to the Kingdom series by Garth Nix. Now there are 7 books in this series, and this is a really unique and interesting series. Garth Nix is an Australian author, and I really like the way that he writes this fantasy world. This is one of those kinds of fantasy worlds where adults are similar to the Roald Dahl effect, where adults in these books are kind of useless or kind of mean. But this series has a very interesting premise. Basically, you have this kid named Arthur, and Arthur, he has found out that there is this other world going on, and there are these keys that he needs to collect, and it just goes from there. I can't even begin to describe it because it's just so inventive. One of my favorite scenes actually comes in book number 2, where they take this ship to the inside of the sun, where there is a pocket of air inside the sun, and it's this whole place that's been around it you can breathe and it's not overheating them. It was just the most fascinating thing I've ever read, I think, in a fantasy book up to that point. So there is the first book in the series, Mr. Monday. The second book in the series is Grim Tuesday. The third book in the series is Drowned Wednesday, and this one is definitely intense. Each one of these books has a villain as one of the main characters, and they're named after the days of the week. So Wednesday is the villain in this book, and the villains, they are something else in these books. I started reading this book when they were out in paperback, and then I was slowly getting them as they came out in hardback after book number 3. So here's book number 4, Sir Thursday, and this one is book number 5. This one is Lady Friday. Such an interesting, awesome cover. Love these. And the next one is Superior Saturday, book number 6 in the series. And this one also had a super great scene where they're climbing through all these girders and rafters. And it was just so fascinating. Such a great, awesome action set piece in these books. They're so good. And then the last book in the series is Lord Sunday. And I will tell you, this series does end on a very interesting note. At first, when I had first read it, I thought, did you not know how to finish this series? It was very epic, a lot was happening, and I kind of think you didn't know what to do with it. But the more I've thought about it, the more I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that is the ending. That is the ending that you could come up with that would be the right ending for the series. And this definitely is one huge ending. It is climactic, and then there is such an interesting moment at the very end where everything is just amazing. So definitely check out this series. It is one of my favorites for sure. So my 4th favorite series of middle grade fantasy books is none other than Brandon Mull, Fable Haven. These books are so great. I had this book. This is a first edition hardcover book that I bought a long time ago when this book first came out in the early 2000s. And I remember having it on my shelf because I had thought it looked interesting. And then I finally read it once all 5 of the books were out, and I kept thinking, why did I wait to read this series? This series is all about these 2 siblings, Kendra and Seth, who discover that their grandparents are caretakers of a magical preserve where there are all kinds of creatures and magical, beings and things that live on this preserve that they are protecting from the outside world, as well as protecting the outside world from these creatures. Because some of them might be gentle and friendly, but some of them are evil. Brandon Mull is one of those writers who often has so many things going on in the text, and a little thing that you thought wasn't that important comes up later, and it is just so incredible how he takes those things and weaves them together like that. I love this series. Can't say enough good things about it. So this is book number 1, Fable Haven. And then book number 2, Rise of the Evening Star, which this one has this giant toad in it, and it is wild. So wild. And then book number 3, Grip of the Shadow Plague. And this one has one of my favorite ending villains in a book. It was so creepy. It was so good. I just kept thinking, how are they going to get out of this? So good. Loved this book. And then book number 4, Secrets of the Dragon Sanctuary. This one is so good. I remember loving this one because there's a little bit of a survival element to this one. There are some things that expand the world of Fable Haven that happen in this book. And it is just non-stop action and intense and suspense and all the things you want in a fantasy book. It's so good. And then the last book in this series, book number 5, is Keys to the Demon Prison. And this is a long book. These ones are not short. And I could not read this book fast enough. I plowed through it because it was so excellent. The quest they go on is so good. The way that things wrap up, the twist at the very beginning of the book that blew my mind. I loved it. Can't recommend this series high enough. So my third favorite series of middle grade fantasy is probably one you might not have heard of, but it should be one you've heard of. I love this series so much. The first book is book number 1 in the Books of Umber series by P.W. Catanese, Happenstance Found. And ignore the covers. These covers were coming out at the time when CGI covers were kind of a big thing, so ignore the covers because what's in the pages is what matters. These books have some of the best plot twists I have ever read. The plot twists are so good. The suspense is so good. The fantasy world that's created here is so intriguing and threatening, and it has that kind of thing that he does in these books where you kind of see glimpses of things that slowly get explained, but not in an annoying way, in a, oh, I didn't know there would be more with that. What's happening over here? So good. Love these books so much. So this is book number 1, Happenstance Found. And then book number 2 is The Dragon Games, which this one was a lot of fun and expanded the world so much. So good. And then book number 3, The End of Time. And this one, oh wow. I could not believe the things that happen in this book. The ending climax of this one is just mind-blowing. So good. Love these books. The character development is incredible. I will say this book has Easter eggs in it from another series of P.W. Catanese from his book, The Riddle of the Gnome, which I definitely recommend reading if you're going to read this last book. I think it's best to read that one before you read this third book because it ties in quite a bit in a really great way. So that is such a great series. Don't miss this one. They're so good. So my number 2 favorite middle grade fantasy series, going back to an old favorite, it's Brandon Mull with the 5 Kingdoms series. I love this series. I think this is one of his best plotted, most tightly plotted, has some of the best villains in my opinion, has some just daring escapes and moments where you're thinking, how are you going to get out of this? And it just is so inventive and incredible, and I love the sword that the main character Cole Randolph in this book gets. This book is all about a kid named Cole who gets sucked into this world that's kind of an in-between world where all these fantasy things take place. There's so much going on there. But the longer he's in this fantasy world, the more he will be forgotten by everyone he knows in his real life. And so he's trying to get back home when he gets involved in an epic battle against evil in the 5 Kingdoms. It is just so incredible. These books are so, so good. I don't even want to say more about them because they're just so good. The fantasy here is just such great Portal fantasy stuff going on. Like I said, the ending of this whole series is absolutely incredible. Each book never lets up. Each book is so fascinating with new characters and new places that you explore. And you do get to explore all 5 kingdoms in these books, which was the best in my opinion. I love being able to explore these fantasy worlds instead of just talking about parts of them. I love it when an author takes the characters to the places. So this is book number 1, Sky Raiders. And then book number 2, Rogue Knight. Loved this book. Such good plot twists in this one. It was so good. And then book number 3, Crystal Keepers, which this one had such an interesting like techno kind of vibe to it, like a technology fantasy vibe. So good and so interesting. I had never read a fantasy book quite like this one until I read this one. And then book number 4, Death Weavers. Oh, wow. This book blew my mind once again. It was so creepy because the kingdom they go to is like this one obsessed with death and like kind of graves and all these sorts of things. It was super creepy and atmospheric. Such a great book in the series. And then the 5th and final book, Time Jumpers. I can't tell you how hard it was to wait when I was reading these books as they came out, and this one was the last one coming and I had to wait for this one. It was the worst. I could not wait to read this book. I wanted it right after I finished book 4, and now all 5 books are out. So you can just go read all 5 in a row because, trust me, when you start reading this series, you're not going to want to stop. So, what is my number 1 favorite middle grade fantasy series? This is a series that I describe as like the coziest of cozy fantasy. I've talked about this series briefly, but now I want to talk about it because it is such an excellent series. Sadly, the author who wrote this series is no longer with us, and I really do think that the world is just a much sadder place because we don't have more from this author, because the things that M.L. Foreman contributed to us through this series is just incredible. If you want the cozy fantasy feel with plot twists and all the fun that comes from like LitRPG kind of fantasy, but for middle grade, this is your series. I'm talking about Adventurers Wanted by M.L. Foreman. This series I absolutely loved. Now I will say, book number 1's the weakest of the entire series, in my opinion. I think book number 1, it was really good, a lot of fun, a great quest, all those sorts of things, but it is the weakest in the series, and it does get better as the books go on from this first book. But this is the first book, Slathbog's Gold, and each book contains a quest, but don't think it's just quest to quest, because there are overarching things taking place that start as like kind of just a little wrinkle in the story here, but they start to unfold throughout the rest of the books. So this is book number 1, Slathbog's Gold. And then book number 2, The Horn of Moran, which, oh, this one was so creepy. That face that's in like the shadow. I can't say anything. Don't say anything, Shaun. Don't say anything. Just pointing it out what's on the cover. Anyways, this is another great entry in the series, book number 2. And then this one is one of my favorite books of all time. It's probably up there as one of my absolute favorites. Someday I'll have to do my absolute favorites as of the recording of whatever video I'm recording, but this is one of my favorites, and it is Albrecht's Tomb, book number 3 in the Adventurers Wanted series. This one, so good. It was so cozy, so nostalgic. Just, it was everything you wanted in a fantasy book that just took you on a journey that was just so heartwarming, but also suspenseful and intense at the same time. Love this book so much. And then book number 4 is The Sands of Neza. And I have to say, the opening 140 pages of this book were some of the most intense fantasy stuff I have ever read. It was just nonstop. I was gasping out loud the entire time, which if you've watched this channel at all, if you know, when I gasp out loud at something in a book, It is because it is so good and is incredible, and I can't believe what's happening. And this first beginning of this book was so great. I will say the last like half of the book slows down a tiny bit, and it's just because in juxtaposition with the first part of this book, you just feel like, oh, that was just so intense and so incredible. And this is still good, like really good, but it's not at the same exact level as what you were having happen at the beginning of this book. But this one is still another excellent entry in the series. And then the last and final book in the series is The Axe of Sundering, which this one was really interesting. I will not tell you anything about the axe because I think that is one of the most fascinating fantasy things I've read in a long time. But the plot in this book is so incredible. The character development is so moving. And knowing this was the final book that M.L. Foreman wrote just gave it just such a gut punch of emotion. And this ended the series on such a great note. I loved this book so much. Love this series so much. I can't wait to reread it sometime. I can't even like explain to you like my level of emotion of how good this series is. So those are my top 5 favorite middle grade fantasy books. What are your favorite middle grade fantasy books? I would love to know if there's some that I've never heard of down in the comments below because I'm always looking for more. I love these books. They're my favorites to read. I think because they're a little quicker than adult fantasy books, the world building happens a little faster, and I just love the inventiveness. There's so much inventive stuff that's going on in so many of these books. They definitely are a must-read, in my opinion. I think if you love fantasy books of any kind, all 5 of these series are going to be right up your alley. Definitely check them out. So until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye!